Move over to this. Share my screen with you. All right, it's looking like the share screen's not working there, so I'm just going to have you pointed towards that if you're online, and hopefully you can see all that. And just make sure I say everything I need to. All right, so let's get started. First off, you are in the room for the social studies contest. If that is not what you plan on watching, listening, or involving yourself in this morning, you can make a slightly awkward but graceful exit at this time and find something that's more suited for you. So social studies, my name is Andrew Bates, and apparently I'm dehydrated. All right, so we're going to talk about this year's topic. As you can see here, it goes all the way back to when the Olympics was not the multi-billion-dollar world-spanning, world-trotting endeavor that it is, and that you may have just seen as recently as a couple months ago. Started with very humble origins, and this is actually 20 years, 30 years in. And it was still looking not near what it is today. So that's kind of what the topic is. How did it start? How did it get through those bumps? How did it get to what it is today? And what are the current bumps that it's facing? If you're online, remember that you stay muted. Submit your questions through the chat, and I'll try to get through those as much as possible. Again, you're in for the social studies discussion. What's this going to be? Basics of the contest. So first off, how many people are new to the contest? This is their first year they're taking part. All right, good. That's great. We like to see new people. So I will cover some of the basics, but I'll go through them kind of quickly. So if you have a question, be sure to stop me, force me to slow down and explain that a little bit more in detail. Because I want to cover all those, but I want to get to some of the more in-depth parts of it as well. So I'll cover the nuts and bolts, but I'm going to try and get into some of the specifics to do kind of an all-in-one. Sometimes during the summer when we do the Capital Conference back before the apocalypse, we would have two sessions. One would be more of a beginning, one would be more advanced. This is all rolled into one. So I'm going to try and do both, which means if I cover something that I think everybody knows, if I assume that you know it and you don't, and you want me to clarify, feel free to stop me and let me do that. And I will answer those questions. I'm going to try and get into why this topic is what it is, how it got there, possible essays that you could see, questions, things like that, as well as strategies, how to study and how to get going. If you don't know who I am, you probably don't care, but that's what it is. So I'm not going to take time on that. However, if you are getting into this contest, how many of you have done this this is your third or fourth year? Third or fourth year. Do you have any people with that kind of experience? Wow, it's great. Okay, so you guys have been here before. You've seen kind of how this rolls out. You can be involved in this process. You can be part of how these topics are made. One of the ways to do that, the best way to do that is through Twitter. I do polls from time to time. I always try to answer questions I get, whether it's through email or on Twitter. Reach out to me. I will try to answer them. It may not be that day. I get a lot of email, much more than I'd ever want. But I do try to respond to it. And so when that happens, sometimes it takes me a little bit to get back to it. Maybe a week, it may be at the end of 2 weeks where I get to it, but I do go back through my email to try and answer those. Okay. So reach out to me. Again, email abates@sabinpass.net or go to Twitter at Mr. Academics. Okay. I use that. Yes, social studies. Somebody asked that question. This is social studies. What I like to do on Twitter is not just look for possible new topics, because that's definitely a thing, but share resources, because I'm into this topic and into the next one all at the same time, and I'm researching and I'm doing things and writing the test as we go. And I don't write all the tests ahead of time. I have not written a single question for this year. So all that's still happening. So what happens with this topic, and as I continue to delve into it, will guide me in those questions. And as I do that, I'll put tweets out. I'll put tweets out about sources that I'm using. I'll put tweets out about events that are happening today, but are influenced by things that have happened in the past that are tied to this topic. And of course, that all guides you to where you might look for information or how you might prepare for questions. Where has this contest been? As you see, it's almost 20 years old. I used to talk about this contest. I'm like, this is one of the new contests. Because relatively speaking, I guess it still is. I mean, when you look at CX debate being over 100 years old, then this one is relatively new. But at the same time, it's grown. It's almost 2 decades in. What we've done is we've gone to, like CX, we alternate between a domestic topic and a foreign topic. And this is our foreign topic year, with the Olympics being international, obviously. However, we are biased by who we are and where we are and what we are. And so there is certainly a strong U.S. showing in this category, in this topic. So even though it's foreign, the U.S. is involved maybe more this year than it would be in other years. Certainly when we look back to, say, East Asia, there were still questions and topics and people in the individuals that you had to study, the terms that you had to know that were U.S. centric, but not near as much as this year. There's certainly a lot more. This year, when we went back to the Soviet Union, again, there was U.S. involved, but not as much as, say, this year. So it is a foreign topic. Next year will be domestic again. So if you have an idea for what that could be, feel free to throw it out there. Big thing about where it could go and what we could do, and if you have an idea for that, is the primary reading source. So the book. That's the hardest thing to find. So I'll read book after book after book, and I'm like, well, this is a good book, but I don't think it would work for our contest. Or that's a great book, but it's 900 pages. Or that's a horrible book, so I don't want to use it. So, there's a lot of that goes into just finding that. And you'd be surprised. Sometimes you think of a great topic, something that you're really interested in, and you think other people are as well. There's just not a lot of books out there, or at least, approachable books. There might be some academic works. There might have been a dissertation or two, but certainly not stuff that you want to read over and over. And so that's probably the hardest part. So if you're looking to have an impact and you want to say what the topic might be, I listened to those. When I was a coach back in the day, I was lucky enough to have some of my suggestions turn into topics, and I was able to curate some of those. But they carry a lot more weight if you've got some ideas for primary sources as well, primary reading selections, I should say, or multiple options is even better. Like I said, I throw out Twitter polls all the time. I think the last one I did for next year, I was looking at a topic on, and decades are always easy, even though we don't use them all the time, the 20s, 30s, the 70s, and the progressive era. I think those were the 4 that I threw out. And those are just 4 that it could be something completely different. I will tell you right now that I like the 70s. I'd like to lean towards that. I think that would be interesting. However, still a lot of people alive who lived in the 70s. And sometimes people who lived through something think they know all about it, even when maybe they don't. So that makes it more difficult to kind of create a standardized, what should we know, what shouldn't we focus on, where are reliable sources, where aren't reliable sources for something like that, because it still has some recency. I know for most of you in this room, you're thinking, that was in a different millennium. That's way back there. There's no way that's recent. But for some people, it definitely is. So again, that goes into what we look at for this topic, how we get to where we are. But let's look at exactly what this contest is. Again, nuts and bolts, just really quick. Individual competition, up to four per school. Again, everything can change. UIL is looking into allowing 6 at district for different competitions. So that could change. Of course, at region and state, it'll still be the same. But you could have up to 4. The top 3 scores will be used for the team score. So you have to have at least 3. If you got 2 of the best people in the entire state and they're just bombing on everybody else and destroying all the competition, still can't win team, even if those 2 individual score is higher than any other 3 individual scores. Got to have 3 to make that team. Okay? And if you have 4 people on your team at district, top 3 scores are A, B, and C. At region, top 3 scores could be B, C, and D. State, top 3 scores could be B, C, and A again. It doesn't matter which 3. That can change, but it has to be at least 3, and you can have up to 4 on a team. Like I said, wild card is, I always harp on this because it's something that's near and dear to me. When I was competing, we won state 3 times as a team before we ever won region, because our region was just really hard, and maybe we were slow and just took us a while to get going, but our region was really difficult. And so we would make it to state, but only because the wild card. And what the wild card is, if you're not familiar, is the best second place team in a region advances. So normally it's just the top team out of every district goes to region. But the best second place team out of the entire 8 districts that make up every region will also go to region as the wild card. And then the top second place team at the 4 regions can make it to state as well. And that's what happened with us, where we just couldn't get over the hump for the longest time and take a regional championship, but we were able to get second. We had the highest score in the state of any of the second place teams, made the state, and then we won state. By then we got our act together, something clicked, and we were able to win 3 times at state before we ever even won region, and it's all because of wildcard. Last year, because of, again, the apocalypse, we weren't able to have the wildcard because we had the different pods and trying to create fairness and equity amongst all those different environments and create a wild card. It just didn't seem feasible. So they suspended it for last year, but it's back. And so that's always important. Just because you're in a really tough district doesn't mean you can't make it to region because the wild card's there. Just because you're in the toughest region doesn't mean you can't make it to state because the wild card's there. So be aware of that. All right, what's the test look like itself? It's going to have 45 questions total, divided into 3 sections. You're going to be able to get 80 points on the objective portion. Get to the essay, 20 more points possible. Okay, possible. It's very difficult to do that, but still possible, for a total 100. Keep it nice and easy there. 100 points possible. Okay, essay is very important. Failure to submit it means that your objective portion will not be graded. So you got to at least try on the essay. Again, what does it mean to try? That's up for interpretation, but specifically stated, it says that it must be a sincere effort. So even if you just restate the topic and say, this was very important, that's an effort, somewhat sincere. It's not talking about, your favorite Star Wars movie or where it places in, the list of total Star Wars movies. So it's sincere. It's about the topic. That's fine. If you don't know anything about it, at least you wrote the essay and your objective will count, because maybe your objective was great. And of course you want to help your team as well, but you can't be graded as part of your team score if you don't write an essay. Now, just because you write an essay doesn't mean it'll be graded. Only the top 8 objective scores have their essays graded. Very similar to current events, if you're familiar with that. How many of you in here take part in current events? Usually there's a good bit of crossover. Current events is headed up by the good doctor, Dr. Wilson, a friend of mine. We'll be doing a session later today that's on the essay portion of both contests, but it's very similar if you're familiar with current events in that the top 8 objective scores will get their essays graded. Otherwise, you could have 60 people, 40 people, however many you're competing. You have to grade all those essays. It usually doesn't end up well. So we just take those top 8. If there's a tie at the objective score down at the bottom, then it can end up being 10, 12, 14 essays graded. It's the top 8 all the way down to a tie. Ranking them, you take the individual objective score plus the individual essay, and that's how the individual scores 1 through 8, and of course 1 through 6 is your medal winners, generally speaking, depending on the contest, and your 1 through 3 are who are going to advance from district to region to state. Okay, if there's a tie after you add those two together, you look at the essay. If the essay was higher for student A than student B, then student A is gonna advance. They're gonna get that tiebreak win. If they're the same after that, they had the same objective, they had the same essay, so the essays were both 15s, great essays, then the judges just look at them side by side. It's not a number thing. Numbers don't change. You just look at it and say A versus B. You have to pick one. Gun to your head, which one are you going to pick? I don't know why there's a gun in my head. We're at a UIL contest. Shouldn't be here. But I'm going to pick A. A wins tiebreak. Okay? That's how it's done there. Top 3 objective scores create the team score. Tiebreaker for that is, of course, going to the 4th team member. If you don't have a 4th team member, because you don't have to be in the team, then automatically you would lose that tiebreaker because you don't have a score to break. So even if you have a 4th person who just signed their name and put A all the way down, probably going to get one of them. So they would win in that tiebreaker because you have to go to the 4th person. They used to not do that at state. They do it all the way to state now. It used to be just, it's state. Everybody's happy. We made it state, so we have a tie. We just have 2 winners. Now we're cutthroat. We don't do that. I don't know if they cut back on the plaque funding or something, but they decided no. It's only 1 plaque, 1 winner. That's how we do things. So we break those ties all the way, which they always did at district and region anyways, because they do it at state as well. All right, so what do these different categories look like? Remember, I said the test is divided into 3 different sections, okay? On the objective portion, it's best answer. So best answer means when you look at that actual score sheet or answer sheet, it's the best possible answer. Because theoretically, as you get into this topic, you will become what you feel like, an expert on this topic. And some of you will be out and out experts. You'll get into it so much. And so you might be able to justify why one of those 4 selections could theoretically, in some circumstances, be considered correct for that. But the best answer choice is what you're looking for. Now, generally, I'm going to try and make it to where there's only one conceivable answer, and it's not really debatable. But sometimes, it's history. It's not math. And so, even in math, some things, well, actually, a lot of things are debatable. So there are things that can't be exactly discerned yes, no. And in that case, it will go to the best answer. Now, if even beyond that, there's a debate, well, then that means I made a mistake and it's a bad question. And so we'll move on from there. But always remember that. So don't let that throw you off. You're like, well, sometimes I think this could be right. Yeah, but if this is always right and this is sometimes right, go with always right. 20 questions are in part 1. Total of 20 points because each one is 1 point. This is over general knowledge and terms. This is when you go on the website and you get the list of everything you're supposed to know and dive into. All the people, all the places, terms, and things, they go into section 1. Okay, 1 point apiece, pretty straightforward there. Part 2, that is over the primary document. Okay, that's the primary source, which this year is going to be Rome 1960. Now, clear a little bit of confusion because the subtitle of this, The Olympics That Changed the World, is one version. You see sometimes a reprint version. It's the Olympics that I think shook the world, right? It may have been tickled the world or somehow altered the world, but it didn't change it. Still the same book. I talked to the author. I was like, you're confusing everyone. Why is this different? He's like, it's just changed that. That's it. It's the exact same book. So don't worry. If you look at this and then you look at your book and like, no, mine says it's the Olympics that altered the world. It's still the same book. In fact, I think he changed it. I've talked to the author just a little bit. about a couple things, but I didn't really go into this. But there was some pushback after it was originally out, and it got a lot of praise. But that did it really change the world? Maybe he's going a little far with that. And so I think maybe when they reprinted it into the paperback, we decided to dial it down a notch with as far as that goes. But that's what section 2 is over. There's 15 questions. It's going to be 2 points apiece. So again, 30 points there. So you have 20, 30. Now you got your 30 points left, which come from part 3. Only 10 questions here. Each one is worth 3 points. So section 1, 1 point. Section 2, 2 points. Section 3, 3 points. This one is over the supplemental readings and documents. Again, this is how the contest is generally set up every year. Doesn't matter what the topic is, but every year it's generally set up this way. The only difference is that sometimes section 2 and section 3 flip-flop to where the book ends up in section 3 and the supplemental documents end up in section 2. This happens when the book, I feel like, just doesn't have enough worthy question or questionable material maybe from it. It would be too much minutia to draw 15 questions a test from it. So I flip them. But generally, this is where we stay. This is the standard. This is what you're going to see. And it's what you're going to see this year. So the 10 questions are going to come from the supplemental documents. In a given year, this could be court cases. This could be legislation. This could be speeches. This could be any kind of primary documents where you're talking like letters home during that particular period of history. Could be newspaper articles, or it could be, as you see this year, academic articles. And we'll go into exactly what this year is in just a little bit once we get through these basics. Next part is the essay. I'm not going to go into this a whole lot because, like I said, I have an upcoming session today with a good doctor where we go over this more in detail. But I will tell you, when I used to coach, and it's been 3 years now, but I still would call it, I didn't focus on this as much because I was focused so much on the team. I was like, well, the team score is all about the objective score, and I got all this material, and I can't teach how to write and all these other things. But that's when I started out. As I got into it, I realized that, okay, if you know how to write an essay on this topic, then you actually know this topic. You may know all these details, you may know some of these specific facts, but if you can't really compare them, if you can't really see how they fit together or explain why one is important versus the other or how their connections were made, you don't really understand the topic. And so you probably won't be able to answer some of the more complicated or involved objective questions. So I really started to focus more and more on the essay, and I'm glad I did. It really paid off. And overall, it just helps you understand the topic on a more meta level anyway. So that's why I think it's so important. And now I just preach that to the rafters about how important the essay is. A lot of people, what they get caught up on the essay is, okay, objective is objective. I know this is right or it's wrong. So I either got it or I didn't. Whereas on the essay, I feel like I scored this, but the judges said I didn't make that. And I get that. But at the same time, objective is almost a misnomer because the objective has a lot of luck to it. There's a lot of randomness to what I choose, which topic I pick. And even more than that, say I pick a topic that you feel you know pretty well about for an objective question, the specific component that I ask about is, again, kind of luck. Did you study that? Did you remember it? Did someone else study that or not? Where I happen to get that from. So there's a lot of subjectivity just to the objective part. I feel like the essay gets a bad rap because people label it subjective, whereas honestly, it's hard to write a good essay just by guessing, just by getting lucky. I don't know that anyone just happened to just close their eyes and scribble and they're like, oh my God, I nailed it on an essay. Whereas in the objective portion, you could get a okay score just by kind of randomly guessing and having a little knowledge. So to me, the essay actually has a lot less subjectivity to it and shows who really knows a topic more than anything that can actually be done with the objective. Okay, just some quick tips. Make sure you read the prompt, examine every aspect. Make sure you kind of plan that out first. It's hard to examine every aspect as you're writing. Make sure you have a thesis. That's part of the rubric. If you don't have a thesis, hard to go above the minimum amount of points there. And make sure you answer excuse me, the question that's asked, right? People sometimes, even people who are really good at social studies, have a way of saying, okay, I know you're asking about that, but this is actually more interesting, so I'm going to write you 4 pages about that. And it's a great 4 pages, but it's not about the specific question that was asked. So make sure you read it a couple times so you know exactly what you're answering, not what you want to be answering. And again, we'll go into that more. All right, so this is what a prompt looks like in general. It has that note that's going to be there every time. Then it has a quote to kind of get your brain going in the right direction, let you know what I was thinking about when I wrote the question, some of the inspiration for it. Then it actually has the question. So it's always going to be those 3 parts that you see there. First, the note says you have to write an essay. Otherwise, why did you show up? Because your score is not going to count anyway. It gives you some general guidelines about what you should focus on. Hopefully you've looked at these before the test, but if not, this will remind you. And certainly, you've got time, you've got 90 minutes. Maybe you need a little reminder right before you get going. And then you get to the actual quote. Like I said here, this one is from the East Asia topic. It was from one of the essays, the unreleased essays that didn't get to be used because state didn't happen that year. And then it actually gets to the question. As you can see here, it gives you a slight introduction, the intense and rapid revolution associated with Meiji restoration is arguably unparalleled in human history. Then it actually goes into what it wants from you. Domestic reform may have been more transformative, but the dramatic developments in foreign relations, perhaps the most well-known change of the era, trace the evolution of Japan's international status from the era of unequal treaties to the end of the Meiji period. So this is broad, but it tries to pare it down to, all right, when we had unequal treaties, or like the 1850s, beginning there into the Meiji period, the beginning of the 1900s, what are the major events? Tell me about it and why they happened. This one happened to be a little more broad. Normally, they're a little more specific, and probably if this had gotten state, I would have pared it down a little bit, but just gives you an example of what you're looking at when you see an essay. All right, I'm going to skip through this part because we'll cover that with the essay, and I want to get more into the topic. But this will be posted, so if you want to go back and look at these slides, take a little more time to go over them, you can. Okay. I say this a lot, and I'll say it again later today, but make sure you skip to the end, right? When you first get your test, open it up and look. Well, first, wait until they tell you to start. Otherwise, it may be a really short test. But once they tell you to start, flip to the end and read the essay, okay? You got time. So read the essay first, so it's there. It's in your brain's working on it in the back while you go back to the objective questions. You start doing that. Because if you look at the essay and you freak out because you don't know anything about it, that's not a nice feeling, but at least you get it out of the way. It'd be a lot better to get it out of the way, and then you go to the objection, you're like, okay, I know that. You start to calm back down, your heart rate starts to slow back down, your blood pressure gets back to something, that your doctor's not worried about. And then you get to the essay again, and you're ready to deal with it. That helps. If you wait until the end and then you don't know anything about, and suddenly you don't have as much time, you start to sweat, and then it creates a whole situation. So make sure you read that first. The other thing is there might be some questions that you see that actually help you. Write those notes down and like, oh, I'll use that when I talk about the essay. Certainly can happen. Doesn't happen all the time, but it can. And just in general, while you're thinking about different objective questions, something might go off in your brain and say, oh, I should make sure I mention that when I write the essay. And again, all that's going to help. Okay. At the very least, it just makes it easier to write at the end because you already know what you're doing. All right. So very quickly, just go over 80 perfect objective score, 20 perfect essay. Together, you can, and I have seen it, rarely, but I've seen it, get a 100 total. Top 8 are going to be your objective papers that get their essays graded. There could be ties at the bottom, like I said. Perfect score on the objective, but not place. It can happen. Generally, it doesn't, because if you can get a perfect score on the objective, generally you know it pretty well. So you can write a pretty good essay, but you may not. And so if you don't take both portions equally seriously, then you get that perfect score, you get a really bad essay, you don't place. Okay. It happens. I've seen really high objective scores not place, or at least not advance, because of the essay. You could also have the greatest essay. You could move a judge to tears with your essay. And maybe that judge was just having a bad day, but regardless, that could be a great essay, and yet no one ever reads it or gets the chance to have that emotional cathartic moment because you didn't do well enough on the objective, so it didn't get to the top 8. You got to make sure you're looking at both there. Again, team scores, top 3, 4th place will tie it. And then the individual tiebreak is the essay. So again, it gets that extra bump in importance, because if it comes down to, wow, it's close, it's close, it's close, it all looks the same, the essay is going to determine who goes on and who doesn't. Okay. All right, so let's get into it. What is this topic? Dramatic pause. What do these maps show you? Show you information, obviously. But they show you politics. They show you history of the Olympics. These are where all the different winter sites have been, all the different summer sites throughout the Olympics history. But that's the thing that people don't always get from it, that I mentioned, is the politics that are shown there. I mean, you notice that no dots here. Okay, so it's the Winter Games. Maybe Africa and South America aren't the best place for them. Although, certainly, you could argue that there are places where it can happen. Also, there are places where it's happened that have not been great for winter anyway. So let's go to the Summer Games. And you again see Africa, nothing. Most of Asia, nothing. I mean, it looks like a lot because all of Russia is covered, but it's actually just one games in 1980 where half the world didn't go anyway because of a boycott, because of politics. And so really, it looks like a much larger area than should be represented by one game. Okay? So you notice a lot of different areas that aren't covered. Again, Brazil, one game, very recent. We can take the entire history into account. So almost that entire continent is free from representation. In fact, anything really below the United States is barely represented, except Australia, which gets a couple bites at the apple. Again, why is that? Why would Australia be suddenly represented and these other areas of similar climates, geographically speaking, not represented? Okay? So that's what this topic is. There's several different aspects that I think some are very obvious. Let me click back in here real quick. Some are very obvious, and certainly those are a big part of it, but then others not so much. And the politics of sport, not just the Olympics, but sport, are really what drove this topic and its creation. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about here. You pull a thread, and the rest of the world is attached at the end, is basically what this sums up here. This is a Nadim Aslam, that's what it is, yes, quote that I like. And it really kind of talks about the journey of making these topics, and certainly this one here. Okay. It was very different than maybe any other topic we've had, just because it's not as obvious. It's not as the material out there for, let's say, World War I, World War II, right? There's tons of it. You know, you can't go down a book aisle. You can't go online and just, you know, type in the vaguest description of something, and suddenly you're going to get just pages and pages of references, videos, people's ideas, and opportunities to study those topics. The Olympics, not really that way, at least not in depth. A lot of it is just, you know, who won, what race, how fast were they, you know, how strong were they, how fast, you know, the whole Olympic code, obviously, faster, higher, stronger, but not a whole lot for an academic, for someone studying it to dive into. And that was actually really difficult, and I almost gave up on this several times. We were almost studying the French Revolution this year. Some of you probably are disappointed by that. You're like, oh, it's like, why wouldn't we be doing that? And maybe we will very soon. But I almost gave up several times because it was more difficult. But I think it ended up being really great. These are some of the books I used to help me formulate the topic. I always like to include those. because some people are interested in reading them themselves. But before you go into all of them, let me talk about them. This one, obviously great, and I'll go into it for other reasons in just a little bit of why I picked it. The games, this is one of the best ones if you want to cover the entire history of the Olympics. That's David Goldblatt wrote that. Really good book, very comprehensive, goes into a lot of the politics of it as well, but also covers just the specifics of like, hey, this was really cool when this person broke this world record or that world record. The dream team was awesome, things like that. So it doesn't just go into the politics, but the culture and the sports itself and how they evolve, the difference between fiberglass poles and the old rigid ones for pole vaulting, how that made a difference. So that one's great. Dropping the torch, I haven't finished this one yet, mainly because I didn't do enough research when I got it, and the author has an axe to grind, which is not the best books to go for. You can definitely have an opinion when you're writing about history, and most people do, but you want to focus on the facts and everyone else's opinions and report those. And of course, just by who you report and who you give credence to the most, your opinion kind of comes through anyway. But as I've been reading this, it's a little too much there. Not that it doesn't have great information, so you can still get a lot out of it. Just wasn't quite as good as I wanted, so I pushed it to the side to finish all the others first, and I just started going back to it. Because you can definitely be against the boycott, which a lot of people are, certainly in one of the articles in section 3, is for various obvious reasons, but go about it in a more structured way. No Boston Olympics. This is about the failed Boston bid. They actually won the bid for the U.S. To represent the U.S. As the summer host in 2020 as the bid. Of course, the U.S. didn't win that anyway. But then a group grassroots efforts started because they realized, the Olympics not such a great thing, not something that we want in Boston, not going to help us, going to cost too much, going to cost this, going to cause this, blah, blah, blah. And this small little group killed it. Just got rid of it with all these millions and millions of dollars pushing it, and really the entire USOC backing it. And they put the kibosh on that. And this explains how and why. And of course, how that effort's been replicated in other places. And it goes back to Denver, who even more so, more jarring when they killed the fact that they won the bid for the Winter Games. And back in 72, they won the Winter Games bid. It wasn't just for the U.S. trying to get the bid. The Olympics, the IOC chose them. And then the people were like, you know what, I don't think this is a good idea, because it's a very small group that puts that bid together. And once the people start to hear about it and they realize what all the Olympics actually takes, they cut that out, which this talks about that a little bit as well, but this is more modern adaptation, and I shouldn't say modern, more recent. The Nazi Games, obviously, this is talking about 36 games, great book. You can't really understand the Olympic movements unless you talk about those games, because they're so important for so many reasons, positive and negative, largely negative. But there were some other things about them that continue to influence us today. And looking at that, if you read this book, if you read that book, if you read this book and this book, it talks about these a lot. You have to know about this game. So this is a very well done book on that. Rio 2016 is just about those games, obviously, about the controversy surrounding them for various reasons, about the costs and about the environmental impacts, and about how they're still struggling to deal with those games, the debt, and the not just the financial burdens, but the cultural and political burdens that were created that kind of brought down a lot of businesses, a lot of companies, a lot of politicians were really just forced out in the wake of a lot of corruption that came out, much of it tied to the Olympics. Many of the communities, in Rio that were destroyed, that people were forced out because of the Olympics, that brought that in. Spectacular Mexico, this is very interesting. It's from a design perspective about the 1968 games, which were seminal as far as the type of designs that were used and how those have influenced design and ads and things of that nature moving on in art since the late 60s. Drug games, this is the most recent one I've looked at, and it's great. Just talking about the testing for performance-enhancing drugs and substances throughout the Olympics. One of the articles in Section 3 is also about that, but this goes really in depth. What's interesting is this is a whole book, a lot of information, tons of information, okay? This came out before Sochi, so it doesn't even have any of that stuff, which obviously could be its own book, and yet it's got tons of information, which tells you how much history there is about people cheating at the Olympics. And of course, it goes into, is it cheating? Should it be called cheating? With some of the stuff, they didn't think they were cheating. They were just taking strychnine because they thought it was good for them. And really, should that be considered cheating or just suicide? Or raw eggs while you're running a marathon. Those sort of things. They talk about all that. And of course, some of the odder things about testing, the first illicit substance that was actually tested for and punished at the Olympics was what drug? Anybody know that? It was alcohol. The guy had a beer before he was doing some of the shooting contests because he thought it would calm him down and help him shoot more accurately. Well, they started testing that year, unfortunately for him. And so throwing back a few cold ones got him kicked out of the Olympics. The people who were doing steroids down the hall, that was fine because they didn't have a test for that yet. Sorry. We can test for alcohol. We can't test for anabolic steroids. So even though I can literally see the guy shooting up in front of me, can't do anything about it because it's not on the list. It wasn't actually banned at that point. So that's a good one. The Olympics, this one may be my favorite just because of how in depth it goes. And this book is actually not that big. The reason it shows up that big is because I've dog-eared like every other page for things I wanted to remember about because I'm old and I don't highlight on my Kindle like I should. But it's just great. I loved it a lot. And again, it's kind of like this first one and this last one that it covers kind of everything. The Power Games covers everything, but from a much more political perspective. So I would recommend any of those. Certainly, you don't have to read all of them. But if you're looking at something from like A to Z, I would pick one of these three to go with. I'd recommend all of them. I just happen to like this last one the best. So what are we going to look at? We're going to look at kind of what these books talked about. The movement, because that's what they call it, right? It's the Olympic movement. What it was when it was first founded, the idea of it, which was, just a very simple, humble idea to solve all the world's problems with sports. They were going to have peace because sports, which is a great idea. It didn't really happen, but got a lot of good things out of it. And certainly it did create this movement, Coubertin's movement. And so it continues, and that's why it's still called the Olympic movement now, because it develops, it grows. It tried to bring all the world together, hence the Olympic rings here, which were brought in the early 1900s, about 1914, if I remember correctly, when the flag actually was put together. Coubertin came up with it. He kind of stole the idea, but he came up with it, and it did originally represent the 5 continents. And again, you may be saying, wait, I think there's 7. There are, but no one really lives in Antarctica, so their sports teams are not great. So they were not included, or maybe it's just a white ring that we can't see. And then America apparently only gets 1, so North and South, we just get the 1 ring. But that's what it was supposed to represent originally and intended, that unity, right? Because that's what the movement was about, is bringing people together. Because you got to remember where Coubertin came from, right? He's from France, and what had been happening to France and was going to continue to happen to France for the next 30 years after this started, as they were Germany's punching bag. And so, he was kind of like, man, we would do better in war if we were better at sports. How can we do better at sports? Well, what did the British do? They're really good at war. They don't get pushed around.
So he went to England and he saw like at these schools, the rugby school for one, which is where the name rugby comes from, and some of these other schools that, if you've watched Harry Potter, you kind of get an understanding for it. Just take away all the magic. These ideas of these boarding schools where sports were very important. They were very discipline oriented. They were gaining all these skills. He's like, man, we should do that, because that's why the British are good, is because they do that, and then they do a lot of sports. And he was right. The British came up with a lot of sports, and the U.S. did as well. But again, the U.S. obviously share a lot of background with the British in some ways. So that's what he started with, and that's a really bold concept. And so that's why a lot of people flocked to it, and actually got started the way it did. So that's what we're looking at, is this bold movement and tracing how it went forward, how it succeeded, how it failed, sometimes spectacularly, like I did pronouncing that word. All those different things is what this topic is. The games themselves, how they're set up, how they've changed, how they've adapted, versus also the individuals involved in creating the games, but also taking part in the games, because the athletes themselves are a huge part of this story. They're not the whole story, but they're a big part of it. So we'll look at both of that, both of those things. And again, Germany wanted those games during the 1930s. Hitler originally opposed the games before he was chancellor, right? He wasn't in charge. Olympics are a horrible idea. Why would we waste our money on it? Blah, 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 blah. Now he's in charge. Olympics are great. Bring on the Olympics. Because he saw the power of it. He saw the possibility. He saw the promise of what he could do, of what politics could be advanced through the propaganda that's built into the Olympics. And that's still today, right? There was a protest, last week in Greece? Anybody catch that? At the site of where they light the torch, there's a protest against what? Against the Olympics taking place in China, right? Because they don't want them to be the genocide games, which of course is not a new term. Used that back in 2008 for Beijing. But now we've got the Winter Games, which again is very questionable that they should even be there for logistical standpoints, because they're going to have to create snow just to do it. But again, China, the human rights record is questionable at best, probably more accurately described as abysmal, with Uyghur population, amongst others. And that continues. This is not like recent past. This is ongoing. And so, having that opportunity for them to put forward this great face of, no, that's not us. It's what people want you to think about, that this is us, and show all these wonderful, great things, because there are wonderful and great things that happen in every country. They're going to highlight all those, throw everything to the back, a la 1936. And then when the cameras go away, go back to the way things were before the Olympics showed up. That's what we're talking about here. The power of the Olympics, but also how the Olympics can be used, and that power can be used for negative ways as well. All right, so what does the test look like? So I try to keep the questions about the same difficulty level, but that's difficult. Just because you try to do something doesn't mean you succeed. But that is the goal. So I make 5 tests a year. Invitational A, Invitational B, and then district, region, and state, right? From Invitational A to state, I try to make the objective questions the same difficulty. That wasn't always the case in this contest. Several years ago, when Mr. McCarty did it, he liked to increase the difficulty. And there's logic behind that. I understand that. I like to keep it the same because I want you to take a test in January on that Invitational A and get a score, and that score to be representative of what you would do if you made it to state. Okay? So if you're scoring a 30 in January, you want to go higher, and you take that Invitational B and you're scoring a 40, then you actually made an improvement, right? It wasn't that, that 30 is actually really easy, so I need to study this, this, and this. No, that 30 is probably what you would have done on the state test. And that 40 you take on B is probably what you would have done on the state test. So I try to make them that way. The essay, though, is not. I try to make that progressively more challenging because it's hard to write an essay, something that complete, when you're still getting into the topic. And I understand that, and that's on a different level than the objective. So I make it more difficult by the time you make it to district, to region, to state. And by that, I mean it'll be over something not as broad where there's just, okay, you can answer anything about it, right? It's not just, tell me about the Summer Olympics. Are they fun? It gets a little more specific into why are they fun? No. It'll have, instead of one individual who say super important, let's talk about Brundage or Coubertin, right? Who are just really just have to know about these people for the Olympics, instead of just saying like, why was Coubertin so important to the Olympic movement? By state, it would be what was Coubertin's role in moving the Olympics from the exposition phase of the early 1900s to their more modern formats by the 1920s. That becomes much more specific than what you would see, even though it's about the same person from invitational A to state, right? Corrections. I will be making those throughout on the list. Hopefully there's not that many, but those would be the only changes you would see to the terms list at this point. It's just something I spelled wrong, a person's name I got wrong, something like that. But those terms are set, okay? I put those corrections out through Twitter most of the time, but just to get them out as soon as possible. But eventually we'll revise the list so it'll say updated on, November 1st or whatever it was after I saw a correction. But August 1st is when they're set in stone. So that is passed. Nothing will update. You're good to go. Your section 3, your section 1, all of that's going to be the same from here on out. You don't need to worry about it changing. But again, check Twitter for possible corrections. All right, strategy. How do you do this? How do you understand this topic? How do you get into it, right? My general approach that I tell everybody, I think it's easier. This is back when I did it, and obviously it's been a while, but I still think it works this way, is you work from the smallest to the broadest, right? Something you can handle, that you can grasp, you can get your hands around, you understand. It's like, okay, this I can deal with. All that looks like a lot. So I'm gonna try and jump over this molehill. Then I'm gonna try and climb this hill, then Everest, right? And the terms list, when you look at it first thing, can appear like Everest. So you want to set that aside. Like, I'm going to get to it, okay? If Edmund Hillary could do it in 1952, I can do it today, right? It's not that hard. People go up there all the time. But I'm going to start with what I know and what I think I can handle. And to me, that's section 3, because it's more finite. It's more limited, okay? Section 3 has the film in it, which we'll get into in a little bit. It has some articles and a couple of things. And, it has the Olympic Games, specific ones, and that's it. Then the book. The book is just cover to cover, right? Every question from section 2 has to be within those covers. There will be no question, nothing in that portion of the test that isn't between those 2 covers. So it's very small relative to the amount of information that could possibly be covered in section 1. So that's the way I think it works best to study it. Knowing section 3, going through those articles and studying those, then going into those key Olympic Games, knowing the main facts about them, knowing the film, that's going to give you a huge foundation, a great foundation about the Olympics in general. Then when you read the book, you'll understand a lot more about the references that he makes, about what he's talking about. If you just read that book without a foundation, a lot of it's not necessarily going to go over your head, but just going to go past you because you don't have anything to attach it to. There's no hooks to it to stay in your brain. Your brain needs stuff to have hooks, needs a reason to hang on to it. It has to be interesting. And if you have no relation for that information that's coming to you, it's not interesting. And your brain's just going to pass it up like it does 90% of the stuff in your day and probably 99% of the stuff I've been saying. Okay? It has to have something to stick. That's how the brain works. So give it that help. Start with those basic things, section 3, then go to the book, much more of it's going to stick with you. Much more of that information you're going to retain. And then when you start looking at section 1 and all the individuals, it makes a lot more sense. Oh, okay, I understand this one. They were associated with 36 games, the Nazi games. Oh, I understand this one. This was pushing for women's athletics because they weren't allowed to do any track and field events except for, the early 20s, and then they banned them. Those sort of things. You start to see that instead of just trying to memorize things that don't really make sense. I used to explain it that you're studying an entire body of work, right? Like literal flesh and blood body. So start with the bones, very basic. Then you move to more specific things like the organs. But by the end of it, when you get all those little details, you're down to every just hair, you're every flake of skin, you're going to know, but you don't start with those, because if you do, it's overwhelming. It just won't make sense. But if you start with the bones and move out, it's a lot more efficient. You won't get as frustrated. You'll save time. And overall, I just find it to be more enjoyable that way to learn, because it's not work. It's natural. It's organic the way it progresses. Okay. And again, the math doesn't lie. Section 3 is worth 30 points. Every question you get is a 3-point question. Every question you miss in section 1 is a 1-point question. If you get to that later, that's fine. If you get to the 3-pointers first, already got a pretty good base. Then you get to the book. Again, 2-point questions, another 30 points in that section. You get that completely locked up, you got 60 points already. And you study so much information that you're going to know a lot of stuff in section 1 because it's covered in parts 2 and 3. So again, that's just my approach. All right, so section 1, what are you going to see there? Okay, what's it going to look like? How's that different than in past years? It was very different. It's not as many terms as past years have had, certainly. Because I didn't want to get into too much minutia. I didn't want to just have, the winner of the 100-meter dash in this year. And I didn't want to get into, some of just the nuts and bolts that are interesting to me, but not necessarily tell you much about the Olympic story. That Astadia was originally, about 200-meter length in Greece, and that was the word to describe it, because the original race that they ran was go 100 meters down around a pole and back. And Stadia turned into stadium because that's where they held it, and people watched it, and blah, 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 blah. But you don't even know that. And I don't really either, but I did. So I tried to just keep the more important things. And that's why the list is actually smaller than it has been, which you may like. Lots of people, that's what I do now. It's generally a large part of people, because people tell a story, right? If I just say one thing, Black September, well, that tells a little bit. But if I tell you a person, you need a whole lifetime of information, right? And how they're related to this particular topic. So that's why there's so many people. There are a lot of terms, right? But not as many in most years. Look for the overlap. Look for the people and the subjects that combine multiple terms. They're going to be more important to you. They're going to show up in section 2, or definitely section 3, or probably an essay. Okay, so those areas of overlap, create those connections, create those webs in your mind of how they're linked. Okay? And when I make those questions, I don't break it down like this. This was actually from, maybe 2014, how the test was broken down for World War I. I don't do that, okay? Because A, that's hard. And B, I don't want to fall into a pattern so people are like, oh, well, you always ask about this, or you always ask about this. So what I do is I randomize it, take it out of my hands. I assign a number to each term, put it into a randomizer for each test that I write. It generates 20 numbers. I look back on the list and I write a question on the number that came up. I will tell you that the people get 2 numbers. So the people are twice as likely to show up in section 1 as the other terms. So again, focus on them. The few tweaks that I'm talking about is sometimes it'll land on a term and I'm like, I already used that term, or, it's right next to this term and I really like that term more, so I'll use it. So it's not completely random, but it's very close to that. Okay. Some may be used in combination within a question. So it's not just going to be about one term or one person sometimes. Certainly if it's a list, if I ask you to put things in chronological order, that'll have more, or I'll put like several different events in a box and say this is related to what person or what Olympics or what other event, so you might see a combination. But generally every year it's about 75 people, closer to 150 total this year, but usually it's approximately 200 terms. All right, like I said, I've hit this last as far as studying. That's just what I recommend, especially when section 2 and 3 overlap, which they kind of do in some ways this year. I would still suggest you make cards early on them. Quizlet's great, especially when people share it, because then you don't have to do it. You're still their work and improve on it. But Quizlet, make cards early so that you have the basics and you can start working on that for your people in terms. And then as you learn more out of section 3, go back to your cards and say, oh, well, I think this is important too, so I'm going to add that to the card. I think this is important too. Just do very basic cards at first. Cooper team started Olympics, done, right? Brundage, like Nazis, done. No, this is probably not what but maybe at some point that should get. Just get the very basics and then have those, because you want to be working on those. You don't want to completely cut it out, but just go back to it as you get more knowledge from 3 and 2, like, oh, I need to put this on that card, and then practice them more. All right, so the book. A lot of books I showed you, and there are actually more that I looked at. I thought this was the best balance, and this is the problem. I go back to what I originally talked about, how it's difficult to find a primary source for primary reading document for these topics. Is that you want it to be approachable. You want it to be, it's a high school contest. It's not made for just extreme academics and it's erudite group of people who want to study. You want it to be enjoyable. And sometimes I do better at that than others. People would certainly have opinions on how many of these books are enjoyable and how many are not. But that's one thing that I consider. It's part of it. And so instead of going to one that was more expansive and more detailed, I thought this was just more interesting. And so I went with that. But the book, again, is a magnifying glass. And that's how it happens most years, where it looks at one part of the topic very close. And you get to see up close the details, the nitty-gritty, the dirt of that particular section of the topic. It's not the whole topic. I mean, the title kind of tells you that, 1960. But as you read that book, if you haven't already, it brings in the founding of the Olympics. It talks about later on in drug testing and things like that. It talks about boycotts that had happened, boycotts that would happen. So it doesn't just talk about 1960, but it focuses on that. And so that's what you need to know about for that section of questions. The book's mainly chronological, which helps. It does go back and forth a little bit when it tells backgrounds of the individuals or the events that it's talking about, but it's generally chronological. The author wrote for the Washington Post for a long time, has a Pulitzer, has a lot of awards for writing. And so is good at it and good at telling a story, weaving it all together. So I find it enjoyable. But what I liked best is that it gave you that context. It doesn't just talk about the Olympics, it talks about the world around it and why the Olympics were happening the way they were, how they were affecting the world and how the world was affecting it. And that's the topic in a nutshell. There's a big part about it. I shouldn't say big, but a good part where it talks about the finances of it, and the Olympics and television, how that was just in the nascent stages of development. Because remember, the IOC was almost broke, going into the late 60s, early 70s. If it hadn't been for television and those deals and those contracts, it may not have made it. Because if you look at all the boycotts and the problems that happened in the 70s, they didn't have TV money to fall back on, which is just coming up in those decades. Olympics may not have made it. And this book talks about that. So that's why I went with it. It talks about so many good issues that really are a part of the overall discussion, but it's focused on what was happening in the 1960s. And again, it talks about the Cold War, which is always kind of interesting. Could be a topic in the future. Definitely something I consider as a document or not a document, but a domestic topic for social studies contest. So if you have any good books on that, you can suggest it. Section 3, what are those going to look like? Well, what is it about? It's got articles. It's new. We haven't done that before, or we really like this, but I like it, and I'm probably going to do it again to get used to it. I like these articles because basically, think of section 3 as section 1, but just highlights, right? So it took a lot of the bigger deals or combination of people in section 1 and went in depth with them. That's what section 3 is. Because you can't in section 1 because it's just a list of people. But with these articles, you can give them more weight. So, when you talk about the tragedy at Munich, yeah, you can list, like I said, Black September as a term in section 1, but you're not going to get that much into it. Whereas now you have an article, it goes further into it, and it's not just what happened, but how the Olympics responded, how Brundage responded, things of that nature. So that's why the articles are there, and that's what they're meant to do. It's really not new information from section 1, but more in-depth information, or topics, I should say. The movie. Not the movie old school. What I mean is we used to use movies in the topics. We haven't done it for a long time. So I thought I'd grab that trend, bring it back. So Chariots of Fire, right? How many have seen the movie already? Hopefully there'll be more hands later on. It's a good movie. So, hopefully you get a chance to watch it. It's 1981. So it's old. But so am I. So it's really well known that the score is actually maybe the most famous part of it, the music from it. You've probably seen it in like a million different cartoons or other like spoofs of it, slow motion running and things like that, because it is kind of iconic. But what's great about this story is came out in 1981, but it's actually about the 1924 Paris Olympics. And it shows you what the Olympics used to be like, which is very different than it is now. And so I thought that visual representation and the stories about it would really give you a sense of that you wouldn't get otherwise. And the fact that most of these athletes, and of course we're talking about Britain, so Britain is even more this. They're probably the most this of any country, but was kind of a pastime for elites. That's what it was. It wasn't these people pulling themselves out of poverty by, dedication and their special ability and taking advantage of that on the track or in the weight room or wherever it may be. It was rich people who felt they were kind of fast and so wanted to show off, and that's what a lot of the Olympics was. And especially in the first 20 years or so. And this shows you that, and shows you how it was changing. And just how the amateurism was such a just prevailing and pervasive debate and really dominated a lot of the Olympics up through the 70s. We don't think about it now. I remember when I was younger and the Dream Team came out, it was like, oh my God, the Dream Team. I can't believe the NBA, these stars are in the Olympics. It was just amazing. I had every single poster of every single player. I also had cards because they had cards and I had a bunch of them. Then my dad sold them. Anyway, so I'm not bitter. He needed gas. What was I going to say? Anyway, so it was a big deal, but I was late. I was really young, so I didn't understand. But everybody who was at the Olympics by that point was basically professionals, except for NBA players and a few others. Right, that ship had already sailed. They were just the last ones, and so it was a big deal. But I thought, everybody was amateurs because I was a nerd and I had read about Jim Thorpe when I was a kid, and I was like, he got his medal stripped because he had played semi-pro baseball and got paid like $5. But that was way in the past. People had already welcomed professionals and had for a couple of decades in most of these sports. But before that, the first 60 years of the Olympics, that was huge. It was a massive debate. And of course, the book talks about it a lot and really goes into it greatly. And Brundage is one of the reasons that it lasted much longer than it should have. But the movie kind of talks about why that standard was what it was, what people really thought should be. And when I say people, I mean the people who are in charge, and the people in charge were elites that were, just wanted to keep it amongst themselves. The games, those are the other parts. There's certain key games, not all the games, certain key games that questions will come from in section 3. That's kind of a foreign topic standard. Generally, when we do foreign topics, say East Asia, it'll be countries that we focus on. When it was the former Soviet Union, list all those, the 15 former republics. It'll have the documents, the CIA World Factbook documents about them, right? This is kind of like that, although there is no CIA World Factbook, but it's kind of, okay, these are the ones that you need to know about. Equal chance of questions, I randomized these as well, but it does get kind of weighted in that the larger ones get more weight, so they get more numbers. So if it's a 2-page article, it's not going to get as many numbers in my randomizer as in the movie, because the movie is quite large, as in 90-page script. So it is randomized though. Related, and these are on the website, but just to highlight the script, you can go there for Chariots of Fire. It's a good way to study it. There are some differences between the script and the movie, so those are important to notice. The featured games, this is a good website to go to from Britannica that lists kind of a summary of a lot of the most important games and some of the other things. Going into I don't want to talk about that too much because I want to get into some of the actual questions. So I'm gonna skip ahead here as soon as I let this person in. So where are possible specific questions? That's what I want to jump to, is what you might see on the test as far as more specifics. So let's look at the essays. Okay? And the essays are important to look at because if it's going to be on an essay, then it certainly could be in the other questions as well. Key people, right? Almost certainly going to be an essay about them. Now, in the past, this slide is generally where all the essays come from. There might be one that's not, but I take a lot of time creating this slide, and I'm lazy, so I don't want to do it again. I'm going to take most of my stuff from here. Now, it will develop as I go, and I continue to do research, and as I write other essays, and I see the responses and things like that, it'll change. But a lot of the basics, at least the seeds of most of those 5 essay questions that I will write, because I only write those 5, will come from here. The key is right here, the overlap. Things that are mentioned in section 3 and section 2 and have terms or people associated with them from section 1, those are going to be essays. They are. So whenever you see stuff start to show up again and again and again, there should be a red flag. Write it down, point it out. That's an essay. Specific examples. Cooperton, of course, got to have it, right? He's going to show up at some point in some part of an essay. Maybe it'll just be the quote, but it's got to be there. Brundage, maybe more than Cooperton, maybe more significant in how the Olympics continued. Certainly a longer amount of time that he had influence over the Olympics. Maybe not as important because Cooperton started it, but you could argue it would have started anyway in some form. That's debatable, but it certainly is worth discussing. Samaranch, of course, is very important. Maybe not to the other 2, but right up there. Especially when you talk about just completely throwing off that whole amateurism, the shackles of that, and creating the Goliath as far as a billion-dollar entity with advertising, things like that, especially when you highlight it according to what had happened financially to the IOC right before he took over, where they were in such dire straits. So really important there. And then, of course, you got all the downsides associated with him as he was growing this brand, as he was creating this power within the IOC, he was overlooking a lot of corruption, hence the bid scandals. He was overlooking the growing problem about drugs and doping, hence, obviously, what we've seen more recently with World Doping Agency having to be established, and WADA's own problems, and then, of course, the fact that they exist, and then Sochi happened anyway, all those things. So certainly could be there. Even Bach is currently there now. But also, more specific people, Richard Pound, super important. Got to look at him with how he was created. Obviously, most people associate him with WADA and his investigation into the Russian doping scandal and all the effects from that. But he's the reason that the Olympics became profitable again, because he was the first one to set up the TV contracts. So without him, the Olympics may not have been able to continue forward as they did. And then he became even more influential with some of the controversies that are happening now and some of the reforms that the IRC had to go through because of what Samaranch didn't really want to deal with. So Richard Pound, very important. Jim Thorpe, obviously, icon, and his story continued. I mean, well beyond death. And the fact that the protests of getting his medals back and finally being awarded, but the record's not being awarded because the IOC said weird. And the fact that there's even a controversy about where he's buried because he was moved to Pennsylvania in a small town that renamed themselves Jim Thorpe. The town is actually called Jim Thorpe because they wanted tourists to come in. And then, his family's like, yeah, but we'd like his body not to be a tourist attraction. And so there's still lawsuits with that beyond just his obviously record-breaking performances and just iconic status as, what the Olympics embody. Nurmi is huge. I mean, he is the ideal for that mechanical, just can't stop force of nature running. That was one of the early international stars, like he was the running Babe Ruth, into the 20s, like worldwide famous, would come to the US, would run in stadiums that would be completely sold out. And just to see him run, and he ran long distances. So that's a long race to watch. He's just going around. But, people like NASCAR, so it's the same thing as this person. But sold them out across the country because he was just that popular. And that's a huge influence. And again, we're not just talking about Olympics. We're talking about the influence of sport, right, on politics and on culture and on the world. And certainly you saw that. Muhammad Ali definitely exhibited that. The book talks about him because that's where his Olympic roots are. But his story doesn't end there, even with the Olympics. Even if you just narrow it down to just that, and eschew the cultural force that he was and still continues to be. The 1980 boycott. He was the representative of the U.S. sent by the Carter administration into sub-Saharan African countries to try to get them to join on with the boycott. Right, so he was actually tied to the Olympics there. It didn't really work, and he actually listened more to them than to the administration. Kind of went to their side of it, where he's like, "Yeah, I don't think that's actually good for them. Maybe we shouldn't do this." And that didn't work out so well for the Carter administration, but still shows you how a lot of these people are tied to the Olympics in multiple ways. Jesse Owens, to be obvious. I mean, I remember doing the Jesse Owens races when I was a kid. It's still a competition that's held. Of course, the tie to the 36 games. Now that was iconic in so many ways. But then, he's mentioned in the book as well and brought out about his beliefs there and his beliefs even moving forward in some of the boycotts that have his story is tied to that. So any of these people here, Zappis was starting the Olympics in Greece, right? Not the Olympics, but the new Olympics that actually took part in Greece. That's why sometimes people say Coubertin's the father of the Olympics, founder of the modern Olympics. That's debatable because they were already happening in different forms in different places. And Zappis in Greece was a real big reason that they were able to happen, and those first games were able to happen based on the money that he left after he died. Had games going on there anyway. William Pennybrook's same thing, except in England. So those could be important people that show up in essays. Political events, certainly, 56 for the Suez Crisis, 56 for the Hungarian Revolution. Of course, to the famous Blood in the Water match, which I almost picked a documentary to include in section 3, because there is a great documentary. It's on YouTube if you want to check it out, the Blood in the Water match between the Hungarians and the Soviet teams, where it was just brutal. It was just like, they showed the pictures, and the guys are just bloody all over in a game that's not supposed to have contact. Because of what was happening in the real world leading up to those games. And of course, the mass defections that happened in Melbourne in 56 because of those things. And Suez Crisis happening that same year, coming in that. Prague Spring, obviously, you're talking about in 1968, but at the Olympics, which is in Mexico City, Kara Kozlovska and her protest, the gymnast who won, during the playing of the national anthem by the Soviets. They got the gold, she got the bronze, and her looking down because of what was happening in her country at that time and that protest and how that affected people. And of course, she was part of the IOC later on as well. But all those things are examples of what you could see, but them themselves could be in the essays. Roots of movements, how the boycotts happened, how they started, why they started, issues like that. All right, I'm going to move forward so you can see some of these other examples. These are essay examples, but also could be book questions, certainly. But some of the essays may come specifically from the book. So they could be about the most important athletes. Rayford Johnson, huge, right? He was the one who actually ran the torch in 1984 games in LA because he was so iconic, 20 years later, 30 years later. Maya Rudolph, talking about Khrushchev, talking about Brundage, as we've mentioned before. David Sim, Bacala running in bare feet and winning as he strode past the iconic obelisk that had been stolen from Ethiopia and brought to Rome by the fascists under Mussolini. That story, obviously, they're talking about. All of those are possible essay topics. And then right here, when you see the women's sports, how it develops, big chance. Television coverage, finances, big chance for those, because those are overarching stories that really dominated the Olympics and continue to influence the Olympics today. Amateurism, as I've already talked about, those are huge topics that you really need to know their arc. You need to know their story, not just in the book, which would be huge, right? Because it talks about them a lot, but in general, how they've progressed. The China problem and the German unified team, and of course, Korea's unified team, we can talk about that as well. Especially the China problem, that's one that fits into this category as well. China's not there, but Taiwan is. Taiwan's claiming to be China, so they're part of it. But then most of the world, except for the US, realizes that this island is not actually China. And so maybe we shouldn't call it that anymore. And that debate that continued for decades. But the book does a really good job of talking about that because of the protest that's involved there. All right, again, look for section overlap. If it's in the list, if it's in the book, if it's in the supplemental readings, all the more reason to focus. It's going to be probably an essay, certainly going to be on the test in those questions. Okay? All right, about the questions. So what are they going to look like? I'm going to show you some things they won't be and some things they might be. Again, this goes back to the Beijing. Oh, yeah, we'll bring democracy to Beijing through the Olympics. Yeah, how'd that work out in Berlin? Not great. All right, so again, let's talk about what the basics are. Remember, there's only 100 questions that will be written over the terms, yet there's a lot more than 100 terms. So some of those terms, sadly, will never see the light of day. And it brings a tear to my eye every time at the end of the year that some of them didn't get their time in the sun, but it happens, okay? The book, obviously, there's 75 questions. There's a lot more of that book that's going to be represented. The documents, there's only so many documents, so there's a lot more of them represented, even though there's only 50 questions. So use that as you will to kind of guide your study. Question areas, generally cause and effects are huge. Evolution of things or key political events. Who was associated with this? When did it happen? Why did it happen? Exceptional situations. What do I mean by that? I mean, firsts, lasts, only, right? This is the first time this happened. This is the last time this happened. This is the only time this has ever happened in the Olympics. Those are questions. So anytime you see that when you're researching, write that down. Oh, this is the first time. Oh, this is the last time. It's the only time. All right, let me jump ahead because we're running out of time because I talk too much. All right, do not expect very simple questions like the United States set a record for the number of gold medals won at a single Olympiad in 1984 games hosted by Los Angeles, California. Hopefully we all knew that was in California. If we didn't, current events is a good contest too. All right. Not that easy, okay? Actual sample question. Now, this isn't from the Olympics, but this is something that's been used in the past, so it kind of tells you. I try to give a lot of background in the question. It's kind of like Jeopardy. They give you a lot of hints. So you may not know the answer, but by the time you read everything in the question, you'll probably have a good idea of how to guess, right? And this is from East Asia. Basically, gives you, intro and then gets to what you're looking at. What event in August 1900 the force finally captured Beijing, relieving the foreigners and Christians there? That is the Boxer Rebellion. Okay? So that's an actual question that was used. And so here is one that is what this topic might look at. The boycott of the 1976 games by 29 countries led by a coalition of African countries was in response to blank being invited to compete in Montreal. I mean, no, just call out a letter. All right, so they were definitely banned, right? As were they. And there were boycotts associated with that. China boycotted a couple times. Taiwan boycotted because of China's inclusion a couple times. But this was actually New Zealand. The boycott was because New Zealand showed up. What's wrong with New Zealand? Well, New Zealand sent their rugby team, which was not even an Olympic sport at the time, so this is kind of not directly tied to it, but they sent the rugby team to a tour of South Africa. And by dealing with them, especially in the sports capacity, that violated the Glen Eagles Agreement. And so because of that, they wanted to make sure that they weren't associated with New Zealand. They shouldn't be allowed. Most countries thought, that's pretty minor. Let's let it go. But 29 countries didn't show up because of that. So that is a great example of what it actually could be. All right, I'm seeing the good doctor is getting restless and wants to take over. So let me run through these. Not something like this. Now, this is the Olympic topic, but this kind of question where it's so focused on the minutia and numbers, specifically numbers, unless it's like the most famous number in the world, like Avogadro's number or maybe pi, it's probably not going to be in there. And those won't be in there anyway, because why are we talking about those with the Olympics? But actual answer here, if you remember the book, specifically it's C, but that's not something you need to worry about. No questions on specifics. This is an older one, but again, nothing where it's going to ask you to compare to a number that shouldn't. Now, in current events, they might do stuff like that because, they have problems, but not going to happen here. This important information, but I wouldn't ask about something so trivial as that. So again, look for the big stuff. I think this actually went to the Danish Public Health Board, but no one cares. No one should care. So don't worry about things that are that specific. All right, last thing I'm going to say, look for these for places to find information. I've divided the links this year for the first time in ancillary versus resources. The resources are things where questions could very much come from. The ancillaries are things that I probably won't get specific information from, but are great to learn the topic. So when you look at the document online, it has them divided there. I did that for the first time because I wanted to help you out there. Last thing I'll say, Wikipedia is great. A lot of people don't like it, but if it's sourced and if it has information at the end that tells you it got it from a verifiable place, go for it. It's great. I love Wikipedia. It's amazing. Donate to it every year. You should use it, but use it intelligent. Use it, be aware. There's also other different things you can go for. This is the Hexco book. I actually did write this, so it has a lot of what I think about this topic is important. So if that's something that you care about, you can look at that. If you don't, you've got tons of other stuff you can look at as well. Okay? And again, I'll post this online. All these will be there. And yes, this is going to be online, so you can go back through it. And any questions? Yes.
Where online are you posting it?
It'll be so on the UIL website. Plus, I'll do a link to Twitter. But on the UIL website, they'll have all the information for this for the student activity conference. It'll be in there as a resource.
Okay, I didn't see it.
No, it's not there yet, but it will be, and I'll tweet a link to it.
And can I get a picture for it?
Oh yeah. Sure.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. Again, email me, tweet at me, and I will get back to
Well, I
you.
have your email. All right, the coach couldn't make her
Oh, that's
son
fine.
died,
Oh no.
so I had to run up here.
Yeah, of course. My email is on the website, and
Okay.
it's in here, and my Twitter's in here. So yeah, just have her reach out to me. I always try to get back.
Thank
How many
you.
computers do you need?
Let's hit notes.
You know, you can put it in notes mode.
I know, but I was. They can see my screen. Oh, I should end that. Bye, guys.
Oh, were you zooming?
Yeah.
Thank
See you later.
so much. I thought we should.
Hi, Andy.
Yes.
You know, there's a Zoom function on this.
I did
You
not
can
know
use that Zoom. Isn't that cool? I wonder if they contracted with Zoom to do it. I'm not doing that.
How do I?
Quick question, Andy. Can you hear me?
I can. It's just barely, but I can hear you.
My students here want to know if you